Welcome to a special series of Beyond the Text, the interviews. I'm your host, Samuel Woodall, and in this podcast series, we'll embark on a captivating exploration of ideas in intellectual history and political thought, through in-depth conversations with former colleagues, esteemed academics, and influential public figures. Whether you're an academic, a history enthusiast, or simply curious about the world of ideas, each episode provides a unique opportunity to engage with brilliant minds who have left an indelible mark on our intellectual landscape. Join me as we journey through intellectual history and political thought, guided by the insights of my guests. Welcome to another episode of Beyond the Text, the interviews. Today we are honoured to have Professor Anthony Pagden joining us to delve into his extensive work on the Enlightenment and its enduring relevance in contemporary society. Professor Pagden's academic journey has taken him across continents from Santiago, Chile, to London, Barcelona, and Oxford. Educated at the prestigious University of Oxford, he has held esteemed positions at institutions such as Merton College, the European University Institute in Florence, King's College, Cambridge, and Johns Hopkins University. Currently, he serves as a distinguished professor of political science and history at the University of California, Los Angeles. Throughout his illustrious career, Professor Pagden has been deeply engaged in the intellectual history and political theory of empire, exploring how the West grappled with its dominance over vast parts of the world and the repercussions of its erosion. His scholarly interests extend to cosmopolitanism, nationalism, internationalism, the history of international law, and the European Union. With more than a dozen books to his name, Professor Pagden is a prolific author whose works have been translated into multiple languages. His recent publications include The Enlightenment and Why It Still Matters, The Burdens of Empire, 1539 to the Present, and The Pursuit of Europe, A History. Beyond academia, Professor Pagden's insights have graced the pages of esteemed publications such as The New York Times, Los Angeles Times, The New Republic, and more. His expertise spans courses in the history of political thought, international relations theory, imperialism, and nationalism. Today, we have the privilege of delving into Professor Pagden's profound understanding of the Enlightenment and its enduring significance. So join us as we explore why the Enlightenment matters now more than ever. Welcome, Professor Anthony Pagden.
Thank you very much indeed.
And we'll go straight into the questions on the Enlightenment and why it still matters. In your book, you argue that the Enlightenment marked a departure from traditional religious frameworks toward a new understanding of humanity. How did this shift manifest in the philosophical and intellectual landscape of this time?
It's a difficult question to answer. I mean, only in the fact that we're dealing with, of course, always a very small number of people, a very influential number of people, and each of them was very influential. And we're dealing with a phenomenon which is always eluded clear definition. I think that's the first thing to mention, that there was a period in the 80s and 90s where there was a lot of debate about whether there's Enlightenment at all, and an insistence that the Enlightenment had a national framework and so on. Now, this, it seems to me, perfectly reasonable. I mean, people writing in English were different from those writing in Latin or from those writing in French or German and so on. They're different intellectual formations, different intellectual backgrounds. But one of the importance about the book I wanted to insist, I'll come to the religious question in a second, but one of those in the book I wanted to insist was that this actually was, as the contemporary German philosopher Jürgen Habermas insists, a project. And it was a project that was recognized by contemporaries as being a project. And so that, yes, they also recognized there was differences between peoples. But there was no real national concern. There was no suggestion that, a David Hume, who was a good friend of Diderot and an enemy of Rousseau, so people became an enemy of Rousseau, saw himself as engaged in something entirely different. There's also, as you may know, been a very influential series of books by Jonathan Israel, who tries to insist that the Enlightenment is nothing other than a legacy of Spinoza, Baruch Spinoza, and that there's an Enlightenment and a counter-Enlightenment, so the world must be divided into these two parts. They're very powerful books, very forcefully written, but I think they're entirely wrong, because if you look at the figures on each side of this wall, you will find that often you will find Condorcet and Hume, for instance, were good friends, to the extent that Hume actually left Condorcet a large sum of money in his will. And these are two people, according to Jonathan Israel's definitions, which should be on different sides of the fence. So there are, and I just quote this not to take a stab at Israel, but simply because there is this highly contentious, what is this thing that you called enlightenment? So what I tried to do in the book was to actually, find an answer, so to speak, and therefore, and hence the subtitle, which incidentally was not mine, that was my publisher's, but it's been quite successful, which was to say, what is the Enlightenment, and why does it matter, and what manifestations, as you put it in your question, did it have? Now, as far as the religious concept is concerned, this, of course, is crucial to the whole understanding, because, of course, what this project was about was, in a sense, you could put it in a nutshell, it comes down to, what this meant was one other thing. But what it was about was what Kant said in 1784, dare to know, sapere aude. Free yourself from your self-immaturity. Mankind has to think for itself. And these claim meant that you had to, not that you had to abandon religion or you had to reject religious belief, but you had to reject the claim that those beliefs, that religious orders, the religious structure of the world would determine the way that you should think and act. So I think that is the important claim I was trying to make. So how it's manifest in the philosophical intellectual landscape, I'm not quite sure how to answer that question. I mean, this was, I'm not sure quite what you're trying to get at, but I mean, one way of answering this question, one way of interesting answering this question would, of course, be to say that this is a multifaceted project, that it operates at very, very many different levels. So we have the Kant at one end, who is straightforward, a moral philosophy, political philosophy, very, very much legal philosophy, something that's often forgotten about Kant, on the one hand, and then you have people like Voltaire, who we mentioned later on, and so on, who are much more literary figures whose approach is via the theatre, because Voltaire, don't forget, in his lifetime was known largely as a playwright, via the theatre, via poetry, via the short essay, for instance, in the case of Hume. There are all kinds of ways in which this is manifest in the world. And so that would be my answer to your question. As far as I say, there is an attempt, certainly with people like Hume, to sort of tear away the structure of the religious world, so to speak, to tear away its influence upon the decision-making process we might have. But there isn't an attempt really to undermine, as let us say, its cultural implications, or indeed its moral implications. In many ways, you can think about, as many in the 19th century said, that this is there's a form of secularized religion at the bottom of this, or not secularized religion, because it's not religion from Christianity, but I mean a form of secularized Christianity. What is under attack all the time is, as it were, the panoply of myth that goes with it, from everything from, of course, all of these phenomena which are inexplicable in scientific terms, that's to say, the Trinity, the transubstantiation, and so on and so forth, and the stories behind it. That's the point of attack, someone like Voltaire, for instance. And on the other hand, the claim made by the institutions, namely the churches, so small one, to, as it were, dictate the terms of one's daily life. So that would be the argument.
Yeah, and I mean, that's perfectly laid out, as you were saying, that sort of like idea of a secularized Christianity in Mozart's Magic Flute, that it's a move from the temple of Christ to the temple of reason, that it's yes.
I mean, one of the targets of this book is Alistair MacIntyre, and for whom I should say, obviously, I have great respect. But and he makes, of course, the point about the role of music in the Enlightenment, which I've left out, because that's also another aspect of it that he doesn't approve the Enlightenment, of course, but he sees it as being essentially one of the things slightly eccentric in the way that he manifests it, but brilliantly eccentric. That this is a form of that music plays a crucial role. So that I mean, not that you're talking about music, talking about the plot, but I mean, nevertheless, it's certainly true that is a crucial element.
Centrifugal, and Yeah.
is a key. I mean, when you think of him as quintessentially, in a sense, Enlightenment figure. Yes.
And the same, yeah, the magic marriage of Figaro and the
Yes.
sort of class dynamic there.
Yeah.
But another centrifugal thing in terms of the establishment of Enlightenment is religion. So could you elaborate on how the Reformation and subsequent challenges to religious authority contributed to the intellectual climate that gave rise to Enlightenment ideas?
Well, as I try to set out in the book, I don't think that the doctrinal elements of these two are not to the point. I mean, nobody was really interested in the distinct. No one's really interested in the debate over transubstantiation, for instance, or much between the distinction between grace and nature, although that does come into occasionally. The real impact of the Reformation was that it shattered the consensus that you up until the middle of the 16th century, say, you had a single church which provided a single authority, that whatever you did within the terms of that authority, that was the authority. You could contest it or not, but there was a single authority to which you could refer. What happens after that is that goes. So there's no longer a single, Christianity no longer speaks with a single voice. And this is highly significant because it's not true of either of the other two monotheisms. Yes, I mean, you could say that Islam is divided into Sunni and Shia. That is true, but it's not quite the same fracture. Neither of them says, is setting out to, in a sense, completely reinterpret what the religion itself might mean. There are variations, it's true, but it's not quite the same thing. There you have a complete division, and the authority of the church disappears. And at the same time, and this is, I mean, it's different, but it's related to it, you have the discovery of America. And that shatters, in another sense, the reliance, which is closely related to the authority of the church, on the ancient canon of basically Aristotle. So, you have there's a moment I always think of as a moment, but when which a Spanish Jesuit is sailing to the New World, and he sits on the prow of the ship and says, according to Aristotle, I should not be here. And so I thought of this, and then I laughed at all of Aristotle and all his works. Okay, so this was the idea. So once this, and Erasmus makes a similar claim about, why should I believe anything the ancients say when they knew nothing about the existence of America? So there's this idea that this is a challenge to the consensus. Now, of course, these are exaggerated statements. It's like Locke's claim you should throw your books out of the window. Locke had a very extensive library, read extensively and so on. But the idea that you should dispense with the world that preceded you, which of course had been embedded in this canon of classical texts, and that was sapientia, that was knowledge. These two, that plus the uncertainty now, the lack of any authorial voice from the church, meant that you were, as it were, on your own. I mean, you could think of it in a world which was fractured, and a world which, of course, the immediate response to this is someone like Montaigne. It's skepticism. It's the skepticism. You can go in different directions with skepticism. Montaigne ends up being highly conservative, but it's certainly whatever it does, it presents. And this is the important thing about skepticism. It presents a challenge. Skepticism is known as the challenge of Carneades after this Greek orator who came to Rome and preached Stoicism one day and Epicureanism the next, and everyone applauded on both occasions. So, I mean, you have this idea: what is the answer to this challenge? And that was, in a sense, what the whole of that generation of the 17th century, which goes under the heading of the scientific revolution, another phenomenon which, in my undergraduate days, was under much attack. And I still think it's a valid conception. I think that they thought there was a scientific revolution. So who's to question what they thought? So that they were aware of being involved in something which was turning the world upside down. And it's out of that, the skepticism that's born of that the Enlightenment comes. It's also, of course, of that, the claim that what the Enlightenment is about the pursuit of science and reason.
Yes, yeah, and progress, and yeah,
it's too simple, yeah.
And yeah, no, that point about the battle of ancients and moderns is obviously something that then carries through so prominently in Enlightenment thought. And you mentioned skepticism. as a guiding principle of Enlightenment thinkers like Montaigne and Descartes, how did skepticism shape their views on the nature of humanity and its place in the world?
Well, as I say, the first point about this is that skepticism offers you a challenge, doesn't offer you a solution. And so you have to come up. Now, one of the ways of doing that is the way that Montaigne himself responded, to say that, I can't believe in change because I've seen what damage it can do. As I have no certainty about anything in the world, better to stick with what you have than try and get to something else which may turn out to be much worse. So uncertainty can lead to revolution on the one hand and deep conservatism on the other. So, but I think what it's a challenge, and what both the thinkers of the 17th century, if you think of this, you can think of the whole process of Enlightenment begins in, roughly speaking, I suppose. You talked of Montaigne as an Enlightenment thinker. I mean, it's not normally thought of that because our periodization is much more rigid. But in a way, you're right, because you can think of the whole process of it going from the middle of the wars of religion in France, where you have this beginning of the collapse of the consensus, through to, Hegel, really.
Yeah.
The whole thing, let's say. So Montaigne to Hegel.
It's very difficult to find bookends ever, particularly going back to your point earlier. That was essentially what the first chapter of my PhD writing last term was on. And the only, I think Norman Hampson puts it the best when he says he doesn't even see any point in trying to tackle what the dates of the Enlightenment are, because everyone comes at it with a slightly different one. The only person I've spoken to who had a clear one was Professor Dominic Aquila, 1648 to 1848, but even that, I think, brings so many issues with it. But
it's interesting. You should choose an international treaty on the one hand and a period democratic revolution on the other. So I can see it's an interesting bracketing and an interesting choice of dates. But I think there are other ways of looking at it. You can see it as on the other hand, I did want to make a claim, if I may say. I'm not
yes, of course.
Do it, but that there is a distinction, and I think that you can see the Enlightenment as trying to re-establish, as it were. So 1648 might be a nice date to re-establish not a political order in the world, obviously, but to re-establish some kind of intellectual philosophical order as a response to what had happened in the previous generation. So again, you can see it as a response to the skeptical challenge, but it's a different kind of response. So if you look at it very, very crudely, if you take somebody like Hobbes as say, or Bacon as being central to this scientific revolution, you could take Descartes as well, but Descartes is much more subtle about it than Hobbes is. Subtle. Hobbes is very good, but he's very straightforward, rather unrelentingly dogmatic about certain points. And one of them, of course, is that we really can't accept any kind of sociability. This is completely unacceptable. There is no sociability in the world. Now, of course, like everything that Hobbes has written or anybody has written, you can find passages which contradict this. But basically, forget what he said. That's how he is read. He, as Hume says, is an out and outright Epicurean. Or the only thing that counts is pleasure and pain. Now, I think that what you find is that, and therefore what happens, and we're trying to argue in the book, is that the whole idea of innate sociability, the whole idea that human beings are sociable animals, all of that goes. And what then happens in the Enlightenment, and this is, again, where 1648 to 17% comes into play, is that we are, and it's ironical because Leviathan is published in 51, but still, we are seeing a return, which in my book I identify as beginning with Pufendorf, seeing a return to a more moderate version of what this might mean. So yes, you want to get rid of what Hobbes called the schoolmen. You want to get rid of this whole tradition of antiquity, this whole reliance upon antiquity and so on. Yes, you want to get rid of the idea that there's a single dominant set of religious beliefs in the world that have to be debated at all times and so on. So you want to get rid of all that. Yes, you want to diminish at least the conception of sociability. But you don't want to take it quite so far that all you have in common with your fellow creatures is a desire to stay alive at any cost. And so you want to introduce something else into. You want to make it more subtle. So that in a way is what is what I see, that one of the aspects of the Enlightenment is to try and claw back, what someone like Shaftesbury, when he's criticizing Locke, says, basically that you, Locke, because Locke was his tutor, so he didn't have very good relationships with him, but still, you have, thrown out, he didn't say the baby with the bathwater, but that's the implication. You've thrown out everything. And in the process, you've left us, you've produced an image of humanity which is too dire to contemplate. So what we've got to do is not go back to the sources, not go back to Aquinas and Aristotle and so on, but go back to some conception of innate sociability, but something that's not, which in a way, but not so reductive as to think that it's just a desire for self-preservation, that it can be much more than that. And so you get this whole question of sympathy, or empathy as we would call it, which of course becomes the dominant features of, which is what I'm trying to argue is in a sense the dominant feature of what becomes the Enlightenment.
And how do you think that that's reconciled by Enlightenment thinkers in terms of that binary of, as you said, competitive survival versus social bonds? And you talk about Puffendorf and that idea of natural law and that it's this kind of essentially human thing to come together. How is that reconciled by these Enlightenment thinkers?
Well, I say most of them, because you come up to the claim, yes, there is a human sociability. I mean, and it is in the recognition of the other.
Yeah.
So that is what I have. I don't have, I'm not driven by some kind of law that's embedded in nature that tells me what I have to do, from the clothes I have to wear to people I should marry and so on. And as the church would have maintained, as the Thomists maintain, right, that I'm driven by this innate set of ideas. Of course, my reason plays a role in interpreting those ideas, but basically I'm driven by these innate set of ideas which God has implanted in me, which allows me to interpret the natural world as it is. And it's a very complicated set of arguments, and of course it's often, dismissed, particularly by the jurists, as being a lot of nitpicking, essentially. What you're talking about is God's command. But you dispose of that complicated epistemological structure that Thomists have put in place, and you reduce it to, as Hobbes reduced it to simple self-preservation, you reduce it to recognition. So I recognize you because you look like me. Well, I'm more or less. I mean, you look like me in the sense that you obviously belong to a species that I belong to, and you therefore can be presumed to share, a lot in common with me, and certainly the sort of basic things you might show, needs, love, hatred, all of these things. So I can emphasize with you. There's this passage in Smith's theory of moral sentiments where that he talks about, which is a commonplace in that sense, and it's not a commonplace in antiquity too, but he's re-elaborating it, that you see he calls it my brother on the rack, that you're not, when you see my brother on the rack, you don't feel anything in the physical sense, but you can project yourself into that experience because that person belongs to the same species as yourself. And therefore that gives you a bond with that, however fragile it might be. But that bond is absolutely vital for the survival of species. Now, Hobbes claimed that doesn't exist. I mean, if you're seeing someone on the, he doesn't, of course, use this example, but if you were to see someone on the rack, what you would be saying is, oh God, thank God that's not me, right? And nothing else. You say there's a passage in De Kive where Hobbes says, even if you think you're making friends with people, you're not actually making friends with them. What you're doing is trying to get the better of them to show how much cleverer you are than they are. So, if you were to see something like, you say, well, thank God that's not me, and I can go away, I can spend the rest of my day drinking or something calmly because I don't have to worry that I'm not being tortured. Whereas in fact, Smith's claim is you wouldn't do that at all. You'd be extremely upset and extremely worried by it because you recognize. Now, it comes down at the end, of course, to the Hobbesian response to this would probably be to say, well, you're just in our sense of the word, not Smith's sense of the word, you're a sentimentalist. You think this is the case, but actually most people would really see that just go away saying, thank God that's not me. Okay, but I think that's the argument. The argument is that there exists this thing which and you find, as I tried to argue in the book, you find this in every single author you can think of. What Rousseau calls sympathy, so what they call sympathy, and what Rousseau calls pity, right? Pitié. Pitié is because we start with this idea of pity. We start with this sentiment of feeling, hurt in a sense. So it's a sense, it has something in common with the Hobbesian claim in that we're starting with something that's essentially a negative passion, if you like, or a negative sentiment, right? The feeling of pity, the feeling of, which doesn't involve an element of thank God that's not me, but it also involves an element of by implication, something I could perhaps do something about this, and I should do something about this if I can. And so that is the basis of my connection with that other person.
Doesn't Rousseau in the Discourse on Inequality have a very similar anecdote to Smith to do with, I think, a horse or something like that it can't pass another dead horse without crying? And yeah.
That's right. I mean, all animals feel this. I mean, Rousseau makes all animals feel this. Smith doesn't. I mean, Smith's claim is much more complicated than that. But yes, Smith would agree. I mean, all animals feel this association with them. All animals have this what they call time species recognition. Okay, so we recognize the species, but human beings go one step further because they have this cognitive apparatus which allows them to put myself in my brother's position as if it were me, but without actually suffering. So that's the crucial step that takes us that step further.
And on the point of cosmopolitanism, as you discuss in your book, it was central to the Enlightenment understanding of humanity as a whole. How did Enlightenment thinkers conceptualize that idea of a shared human nature that we've been talking about, and the impulse towards the social life?
Well, I mean, you can think about it, you extend that outwards. It means that it carries with it an implication that we have some kind of obligation towards our fellow beings, and that above all, we have an obligation not to think of them as being divided up into artificial units for preservation. If you think of again, going back, Hobbes is sort of, for me, always the test of what they're talking against. Everyone is replying to Hobbes in some sense, and particularly De Kiva, which is different from Leviathan in this respect, is much more emphatic about these things. So that there's this sense that you have to do something about it in the sense that you have to make an effort to communicate with other beings, human beings. Now, what that leads to is this sense of that there must be some common denominator we all share in common. A common language, if you like, a common language of humanity that we can all speak. It takes different natural forms, but we can all speak this common language. We all can understand each other at some level. Okay? And it doesn't matter whether we're Swedish or Chinese, we still have this capacity. We may not be able to literally understand each other, but we can understand each other qua human beings. So in that case, it makes nonsense to think of divisions between human beings into nations. And of course, this is also the period when, again, 1648 is an important date, when nation building is becoming important. So if you look at the politics of the Enlightenment, what you're looking at precisely is a world where the nation state is beginning to manifest itself in all its in many ways, it's still an larger international community than it's going to be, say, in 1848. But it's nevertheless a community which is beginning to be divided up into these separate entities, these separate wholes. Having, of course, in one sense, that's also a replacement for going back to what you're saying about religion earlier, a replacement for this idea of a unified Christianity. Because
Sorry, I didn't mean to. No, I was just going to say, which Bellarmine who Hobbes responds to as
Yes.
well, has been arguing about in the preceding
Yes.
century on that split between spiritual and temporal power, and it's massively moving in that direction, which he'd been trying to defend against.
Yes, exactly. So you have this concept of a unified Christianity which disappears, and with it disappears the idea of a possible, single community of humanity based in Christ, so to speak. Okay, and that Bellarmine vision, so to speak, disappears completely as a consequence of this corruption. So you have this eos religo cuius regio, which comes at the Treaty of Augsburg, but it's still emphasized and established as an international legal principle in Westphalia, and then that is in a way the kind of intellectual, spiritual, whatever you like to call it, manifestation of the new nation state. You can certainly see it that way for all the historical quibblings about the actual terms of the treaty. I think the long-term consequences of that. So what you need then is something to replace that. If you think of all of this as a way of trying to humanize, you could say, the Enlightenment time, to humanize this destructive project of the 17th century, in a sense, trying to humanize the nation state, you might say. So what you can have is not that people, cosmopolitan is not just a, put it this way, it's not as they understood it, it's not a rejection of the need. It's not, as Rousseau tried to characterize it, a preference for Turks over your next door neighbor. It is a desire to try and put your Turks and your next door neighbor on the same intellectual and moral footing. That's to say, Smith has this passage about, why should we care for the peoples of China? Well, we should care for the peoples of China because they belong to the same species as ourselves, because they're part of this larger cosmopolis to which we belong. Now, of course, as you know, there's the other way it's often been represented is precisely in the terms that Scruton describes it, for instance, and Rousseau describes it as being a kind of, and someone like Giuseppe Mazzini, for instance, as being really just a way of a sort of sloppy, fuzzy way of privileged people to say, I don't need these they don't need these attachments. First of all, because I'm rich enough not to care about them. Cosmopolitans are the people who meet in the front end of aircraft and airplanes. They're the business class, right? First class. And the people who are stuck in the back in economy, they have to have this sense of unity to keep them going. And that attitude seems that claim, which of course is part of the nationalist response to cosmopolitanism throughout the latter part of the 18th and early part of the 19th century, is something that is simply not what is intended here. What is intended here is not that you should not have a and this is why the passage I quote, which I like so much, is Montesquieu's one. About and it's interesting, it's always put in the negative. If I were to do something that was offensive to my family, I would despise myself. If I were to do something which is offensive to my nation, my patria, I would reject it. If I were to do something, he puts interestingly Europe in here, if I would do something that was offensive to Europe, I would be reprehensible. If I would do something offensive to humanity, I would then. So you build up these, this is what I said, these Stoic circles, right? You start from the beginning and you move outwards. But the point about the Stoic circles is always that, or at least Montesquieu's interpretation of it, and this is, I think, generally true of the Enlightenment, is that it's not that you move outwards, leaving the others behind, which is the sort of traditional Scruton view, Roger Scruton view of Enlightenment, right? Yeah. These are all part of the story.
Yeah.
You have to care for your family, you have to care. And you put those first. If there's a conflict between your family and humanity, your family comes first. But you should never lose sight of the ultimate rim, the ultimate circle, which is humanity. And that's what a cosmopolitan really is like. When Rousseau says when Diderot says to Hume, "You, like me, are a citizen of the world," it's a sort of general phrase, doesn't really have that implication, but the implication behind it is you are someone who is Scots. Yes, you speak French with a terrible Scottish accent, but you are someone nevertheless has this sense of the world as a world of human beings united together at some level, without at the same time losing track or sight of your Scottishness.
Professor Anthony Pagden will return shortly. And on that point, your book highlights the very diverse background and perspectives of Enlightenment thinkers. How did this diversity contribute to the development and exchange of ideas during this period?
Well, I think, as I'm trying to say, I mean, if you think about, you're dealing with different genres, you're dealing with people who, for the most part, are, of course, not professional university teachers. The only one who really fits into this category, I stand to be corrected, but because Hume was never given a position, is Kant. Kant is the only one who's a straightforward, down the road university professor. So none of them are Hobbesian schoolmen or their heirs. All of them, most of them, with a few honorable, really striking exceptions like Condorcet, are not aristocrats either, so they're not self-funding. And they come from, mixed, as you know, very, very mixed backgrounds. So across the spectrum, all the way from Sweden through to Ireland, so to speak. And they work in different genres all the time. So we mentioned this earlier, this idea of being, poets and so on. This is a way that a movement that manifests itself out at very many different levels, because precisely if you're talking about things like human sensibilities, sympathy, all of these terms that are so crucial to this idea of a unified human psyche, so to speak, a human entity, a humanity, humanitas, seen as a single whole. All of that, is something that can be played out at different levels, as you mentioned, music being one of them, or the opera anyway being one of them, to play music and the text together. The idea that this is much more than just a philosophical debate. So I think the diversity, in the sense, the true sense of the term, is something that is again very unusual, because if you look backwards, what we're talking about in the 17th century, almost all of those people who are working on intellectual subjects, so in the 17th century, come from either university backgrounds or, like Bacon, for instance, are aristocrats themselves. So there's a much broader burst. It has this thing that Habermas talks about, the ideal speech situation. You have this talk about everybody involved in this discussion, that this is a bourgeois society, if you like. This is the blossoming of the bourgeois society. So it extends well beyond this what Hume calls cells and chapels. Hume's very idea of saying what we have to have, and his preference for the dialogue, for instance, over the treatise, was to say we have to have a language which we can go beyond, this little elite, which of course is associated in the past with the church, which could then dominate our way of thinking. We have to broaden out, and even as you know, even Kant has this project of, always involved in this project of what was called popular philosophie, and this idea of a popular philosophy. And this great thing on the Enlightenment, of course, is published in this thing called the Berliner Monatsschrift, which is a popular journal, and popular in the sense we wouldn't recognize possibly, but nevertheless, it's certainly far broader. It's a far broader in sort of range of things. So we're trying to bring in, obviously from a historical point of view, you're trying to bring in a new class of people who are wealthy, and literate, and of course, and also very, very energetic and concerned with change and learned in their own way, but their own way isn't that of the previous sort of monastic, can put it in terms of generation. So I think there is, as all historians have always pointed out, what you're talking about is a phenomenon which is not just intellectual, it's also economic and social. And there's no space for that in my book. I don't mention that. But I mean, I think it's important I think it would be, if I rewrote it again, I'd probably have to say more about that, because I think it is important that we're dealing with Marx thought of as the revolution. I mean, the bourgeois revolution, of course, leads up to the French Revolution. And that without that element, this Enlightenment wouldn't have had an audience. It has an audience, and a very successful audience. You think that Rousseau's Émile, sold so many copies that they had to rent it out by the hour. He didn't make any money from it, because in those days authors didn't make money, didn't have royalties. But the popularity of these books goes far beyond anything that was, happened 100 years earlier. I don't know what the numbers of copies we're talking about, but certainly, that there was this huge readership suddenly by comparison with what existed before.
Which is interesting, because on a point that I always sort of, well, I'm certainly looking at the moment, there's obviously quite a large middling class in England. So you'd think that England would be, I'm not including Scotland in a Britain idea, but just specifically England and with London, you'd think that with the number of books being published in London because of the bans and everything on the continent, you'd think that that would be the place for Enlightenment to be flourishing. And I know commentators like Voltaire and Montesquieu do comment on it, but in terms of our sort of scholarship around England specifically, it's quite limited in terms of saying that there's an Enlightenment uniquely taking place in England.
Well, Roy Porter thought that was not true. I mean, he thought that this was tried to argue, and that, I mean, I don't agree with him. I mean, I don't think he succeeds in making the case quite as forcefully as he wanted to make it. But he had a point. I think there's, if you look at what people are saying in Europe about England, and if you think of what the position that, I mean, England starts to occupy a position as a central point in the European perspective of, the intellectual world, with, of course, Bacon and Hobbes and Locke and so on, because Locke is a key figure in this, massive, and the treatise on human understanding is something that everybody reads. So, well, everybody in the only classes reads. So that there is this sense that England is a powerhouse of thought and so on and so forth. I don't think that's not what I think happens is, I don't know. I mean, you could say that there's been an attempt, there's been a historiography. I mean, which is in a sense what Porter was trying to argue. There's been a historiography which is trying to put the focus on France all the time. If you read, McIntyre's After Virtue, his claim was it's all German and that France got nothing to do with it at all. France is just this frivolous stuff on the side. The real, because he doesn't believe in them, but he recognizes the force of the Schlegels and the Counts and the Herders and so on. But so it's really the perspective you take. There tends to be a conception of France as being the focal center, and French being but there's partly because I think French is still in the 18th century thought of as a universal language. Secondly, I think it probably has a lot to do with the encyclopedia. The creation of a massive undertaking. It's an attempt to say this is the textbook of learning, right? And it starts off with this incredible introduction, which of course where I start my book, where where D'Alembert sets out what he thinks Enlightenment actually is, using that terminology. So if you want a description of the project, it's that introduction you go to. So I think that there are various reasons why the historiography has thought about it in these terms, why the English have tended to be slightly marginalized. The other thing is, of course, that after the 17th century, most English authors write in English, and English is not a very widely read language. So that you think that, I mean, that Rousseau is reading Hobbes reading De Cive because it's in Latin. The attack on Hobbes in the later part of the 18th century is being made against his Latin works. No one reads Leviathan, or I'm saying, but I mean, it's that's going too far. But because that's not the language you write it. So that there's this very amusing little anecdote when Bougainville comes back and bringing this Tahitian with him, one of the who then becomes a figure in Diderot's little treatise, but that Voyage de Bougainville. Bougainville says, I was constantly being asked by members of the aristocracy, by the literary world, why is it that this Polynesian hasn't learned, he's been here for a year and he hasn't learned any French. After all, the English can do it in 3 months. Surely he can do it in a year. So, I mean, the idea that, the one thing you have to do, of course, you might say it hasn't changed to this day, but certainly in the 18th century, the one thing you had to do if you were to go was to learn French, because French is the common language. You think about all of you think about the stories of all of them spoke French. Or had, at least we don't know how well they spoke it, but certainly, Hume had these long conversations and spent a lot of time in France, had a long conversation. So it's a way, in a sense, that if you were an English intellectual of any standing, you had to know French. You had to be connected to the French intellectual scene. So in a way, they themselves, but you think of Hume, Smith translates great chunks of Rousseau into English to demonstrate that Rousseau has nothing to say, that he's merely a rhetorician. I mean, that's the way he's trying to get it. And they're brilliant translations too. It's so that you have this conception of French still being, in some sense, the language in which you have to communicate. But you don't write in French, you write in English. So you're writing for an English audience, and you're already writing for one in the terms of those. And that, I think, then remains. But this is merely a historical claim. I think it's not to say that there aren't the great figures of the Scottish Enlightenment. Mm-hmm. It's the Scots who are really the ones who matter. Yeah. And Smith are, of course, considered to be part of the canon everywhere. After all, in fact, Hume is, I think, you could generally say in the 18th century, say by the end of the 18th century, if you wanted somebody to ask someone in Sweden to nominate the two greatest philosophers of the 18th century, they would say Kant and Hume. Mm-hmm. These are the two major figures that count.
And very close to that, but you mentioned Voltaire and David Hume as influential figures in the Enlightenment. Yeah. What specific contributions would you say they made to the advancement of Enlightenment ideals, and particularly around secular ethics and the science of man?
Well, as I say, I think that one of the project, the sort of core you could define, and this was intended to be the title of the book originally, you can define the Enlightenment as that project, making the science of man, science de l'homme. Okay, that's the thing. That's what it says in the introduction to the Encyclopedia. Okay, so there's nothing new about it. So you think about it as that, right? Mm-hmm. And Hume certainly is, it's not the only one to do, of course, he starts with Locke and so on and goes forth, but is certainly trying, that's the basic project, to make us understand human beings in terms which is a scientia, in the Latin sense of the term, a real form of knowledge, independent of dogma, independent of things that have been handed down to us, based upon our observation, based upon our learning and understanding of other cultures and so on and so forth. This is what the science of man is. Now, Voltaire is a very different character, because Voltaire is working as I said, in a different idiom and a different medium. I mean, this is in a way you can think about Voltaire as a highly influential figure who, for the most part, its role is demolition. Right? It's to undo all these, écraser l'infâme, smash the infamy, get rid of the prejudice. That's the sort of, that's the Voltairean model. Hume is less. I mean, obviously, in order to build, you have to destroy you have to take down what was there before in order to build. But Hume is, and Hume's skepticism, the skeptical part of Hume is part of that demolition job, so to speak. But the Hume that we associate with the treatise on human understanding, and also with the various essays on say religion and so on, is a Hume that's trying to rebuild a conception of the human as essentially a scientific understanding, and that I think is what that is what is in the core of this, and also what when Kant makes this famous remark about him Hume waking him from his dogmatic slumber. It's not just the skepticism of Hume, which he could have got from anyone. At least not the skepticism. Could have got skepticism from anyone. It's this conception, which goes into the writing of the first treatise, the first critique. And if you think about it, it's a point that Nora O'Neill made very forcefully, that the first critique starts off with a quotation from Bacon, right? So you have this conception, and it's in commune consultant. We consult together, right? So it's precisely this community. So I'm making a critique of pure reason, but I am doing it as a communal activity, and that is part of the human. That's also, you can see, a continuation of the Humean project as such. So Voltaire, I think, is a very, I mean, I mentioned him quite a lot, but I mean, he's a different sort of character. He's a pragmatist. He's a propagandist. He dispenses, he because of this magnificent prose, but also, as I said, because he's a famous figure. He's an extremely important figure who people listen to, much more so than someone like Hume, who's after all just a librarian, basically. As far as the haute bourgeoisie is concerned, Voltaire is this great figure who lives in this magnificent house on the Swiss border and so on and so forth, and so has the range of attachments, has this ability to reach audiences that go well beyond the salon. I mean, he's a salonier as well, but it goes well beyond the salon. So that is. Whereas, Hume is, when Hume said about, the first treatise had fallen stillborn from the presses, I mean, you can see that this is an important fact. I mean, eventually it became something, I wouldn't say a bestseller, but eventually it became very widely read and very widely distributed. But, but there's the immediate impact isn't there. What you get out of Voltaire is an immediate impact all the time.
And
so I think that if you want to choose those two figures, they are very different, and they represent, in a sense, you could say, different aspects of the Enlightenment. Here is the philosopher, the real philosopher, who is going to the heart of the problem, who is asking you to think, but is also a great stylist. Never forget that. But that stylist, of course, is also, again, what we were saying earlier, is writing in English, not in French. And then on the other hand, you have this great stylist who is not really a great thinker. No one called Voltaire that. I mean, he's not by no means trivial, but I mean, he's no means frivolous or anything, but he is this great stylist. And that is what carries the word, so to speak, particularly if we're talking about this new bourgeois society that's emerging.
Exactly, and someone directly contributing to what I wanted to ask next, which is, how did Enlightenment thinkers engage with the broader...
Sorry. Go on.
Oh, yeah. I was just going to say, how did Enlightenment thinkers engage with the broader cultural scene of their time, particularly in terms of the things we've mentioned already, in terms of art and music? And did these engagements influence their philosophical and intellectual pursuits? Rousseau, I know, composed opera. Voltaire, likewise, was well versed in music. How was it influencing the crucible of ideas at the time?
Well, I think that we have I was going to say that all of the major figures you can think of the Enlightenment have multiple strings to their bows, so to speak. I mean, they have multiple. They work in multiple different fields, but then that's not, in a sense, very unusual. If you think about it, that all of their predecessors, in a sense, in the 17th century did. It's a stark contrast to the university curriculum. The theologians and the doctors and the jurists and so on who worked in the universities. To use Hobbes again, phrase, the schoolmen, right? The scholastics, in the true sense of the term. They didn't. I mean, if you were a jurist in the 16th and 17th, you worked on law, and that's all you did. And you might, write things on the side if you wanted to, but basically that's what you did. Take someone like Gentile, who's this Italian, renegade, converts to Protestantism, comes to England, becomes the Regius Professor of Law in Oxford. This is a great intellectual figure. Never wrote anything that wasn't law. I mean, never occurred to him that he had to write something else. So I mean, he's the most sophisticated of them all. But if you go, then you move forward. You take someone like Locke is writing. Basically Locke is writing in a restricted idiom, but a much more varied one. Then even Hobbes translates, after all, despite his hatred of Aristotle, translates Aristotle's rhetoric into English. He translates Thucydides into English. He's a magnificent stylist. After all, Locke is not, should be said, but Hobbes is really astonishing prose writer. So you've got this. These are all have this trend. I think what you find in the 18th century is it, because of this much broader market, much broader intellectual space, becomes much more varied. So you have this conception that the intellectual, I know that phrase doesn't come into being until much later, but these figures work in different domains at once. And this gives their writings a far greater diffusion than it would be if, as I keep saying, this is the point about it. This is a far greater diffusion than it would be if it was simply working within a traditional university framework. If you think of today, if you go back and think of this constant attempt by university presses to reach a larger audience. This is the frame, right? So this is my book. It came out, was published in the United States by a commercial press, published by the commercial division of Oxford University Press, so-called. And the idea was to reach, but compared, obviously the comparison is difficult. The population size is smaller, the presses are smaller, and so on. But if you think about what someone like a Rousseau or a Diderot reaches, it's ridiculous. As my publisher used to say at Yale, when I published at Yale, the general public is an academic in another field. And this is, whereas when someone like Rousseau writes, now he's slightly of some of an exception, you might say. Diderot is somewhat of an exception. These are figures who write in very different and have this gift for writing in these different modes, and use them all the time. It's difficult to find anybody from the 19th century onwards who writes treatises as well as plays, as well as poetry, as well as music. In the case of Rousseau is very extreme, because he was often, as not only was clearly interested in music, not only wrote music, but wrote music was extremely popular, and wrote about music in a way that was extremely influential too. Sorry.
I was just going to, tried to come up with his own musical sort of tablature to rival the established one.
No, he's an extraordinary figure in that respect. So, and a wide range, and his French is astonishing. But it's simply that what he says, and it's not the matter, but the actual language is incredible. So you have this sense of, which for a modern, indeed contemporary readership, is always something that's always slightly difficult to. Not difficult is not the right word, but it's something that has to be. I find my students always have to impress upon them, because so many academics today, university professors, they think that writing is just putting something down on a page, essentially. As long as it makes sense, it doesn't. It's got to make sense. It's got to be coherent. The argument's got to be there, but the way that the argument is stated is irrelevant, and it's not a form of literature. Whereas, of course, if you think in the 18th century, philosophy is a form of literature. It's thought of as a form of literature. So, and you would find people reading it. The common man. I mentioned it in the book. There's a popular play, early 18th century French play, in which a young woman, it's interesting it should be a woman, of course, because it's part of this idea, this education broadening out beyond the traditional spheres, to demonstrate that she's pretended to be mad in order not to be married to the wrong man, to claim that, demonstrate that she's actually entirely sane, stands up and gives an account of the content of Locke's essay on human understanding. Now, but what is striking about is not only that this is what she does. She doesn't give an account of the latest novel, all right? And the audience, which is a popular audience, is supposed to recognize this. That the reach is there. When you think that even somebody as arcane as Pufendorf, who writes in Latin, who writes this, not very, rather tortuous Latin, must be said, but is also of course a historian. And but if you think that someone like in Tristram Shandy, he's referred to as if the readership would know who he was. It doesn't need to be explained who he is. So this is a book intended for a popular audience. I mean, okay, not a very popular audience, maybe. It's not a piece of gutter writing, but it's nevertheless a popular piece of writing. So I think the spread, is the public sphere, to use Habermas's term, which of course, when he's talking about the Enlightenment, that's also what he's talking about. That is so much broader than anything that existed before in the 17th century, and much broader than anything which exists today, despite the fact that that there are many more books being published, many more books being published than were in the 18th century, and there are many more copies, and therefore theoretically there are potentially many more readers. But in terms of technology is there, but readership is not. I think that this distribution was much wider than. I don't know if that really answers your question or not, but
I think so, and I think it leads on to this sort of next point about how those ideas were being communicated beyond the intellectual elite, and how these ideas were shaping broader societal attitudes and the institutions as well.
Well, I think that I touched on a bit about them. And I think because they find their way into plays, they find their way into popular novels, they find their way into treatises which are intended, again, to use Hume's nice phrase, beyond the cells and chapels. So beyond religious tones, beyond the universities. That means that you have a broad intellectual readership, learned readership, or semi-learned, unlearned. Put it this way, no, so I don't want to use the word learning, because that suggests university, but people who are not university professors, who are not professionally concerned with these things. So that this is, they're highly intelligent people who've been well trained and so on. We don't know exactly who they were. Of course, the fact that women now become an part of the readership as well is also a significant fact, something that Hume comments on. And so that we have this idea that you've got a far broader readership than you had before because of the diversity of types. And that has an impact on, I think it has an impact on the way that people come to think about everything from how they ought to be governed to how they ought to live their lives, to what kinds of religious beliefs they should have or have not. In the way that the only analogy in previous generations would be the preacher, the oral presentation of a set of doctrines. But then that, again, goes back to a world in which there was a recognized center of auctoritas, which in this world there is not. So if you're dealing with, when Kant says this is not an enlightened century, it's a century of enlightenment. So it's a century of progress, or it's a century of change, that these are people who are looking for answers. And if you think that eventually, of course, in the French where you can think about that the general view, the view taken by some of after the event by such conservatives of Demestre, that the Enlightenment had paved the way for the revolution, is often taken by historians as being nonsense, but I don't think it is nonsense at all. I mean, I think that you can think about it as a way of saying it's not that, Demestre didn't mean that what was happening was that people were taking up these ideas and Enlightenment and turning them into revolutionary principles. I mean, the closest you come to that is the use that the Jacobins made of the contrat social, which was true doing that, although they had a very specific reading of Rousseau, just as the American revolutions have a very specific reading of Locke and Montesquieu. But there's a general sense in which you have an audience which isn't the sans-culottes, because the people who make the revolution are not that. They are the provincial lawyers like Robespierre and so on, right? And those provincial lawyers are the people who are reading Diderot, who are reading and who are reading these figures. They're not, okay, they turn against them because they're not ferocious enough, they're not revolutionary enough. But the way of the things that they read as children or as young adults led them, I think, created this environment, this public sphere, if you like to use Habermas's phrase, that made it possible for them to come to these much more radical conclusions later on. So in that sense, I think someone like Mess is quite right, that he saw this as being the destruction of the last vestiges of what he saw as an authoritative structure of order in the world, that then created a vacuum, and that vacuum was filled by the revolutionary principles of the revolution, the principles of the revolution.
And Professor Richie Robertson, who's also written on the Enlightenment and the sort of seeking happiness, I'm interviewing him next week. I suppose similar to what you're saying, that sort of almost in that gap, the sense of fear in the public. I mean, he refers to the 17th century as kind of like the persecuting society century, into the 18th century where there's hope. Perhaps that's why the public is so receptive as well, because they are desperately looking for something to quell their fear of plague and pestilence, of war. I think it's an interesting social analysis, at least, of why perhaps they're so receptive. But finally,
sorry.
No, please.
Well, that aspect is true. I just think of Montesquieu's claim that after the death of Louis XIV, then the world opens up. I mean, it's a particularly French view of it, but I mean the sense that you've got the end of roughly speaking, towards the end of the 18th century, there's a new hope, because there is this thing that then they call Enlightenment beginning to take place in this period that starts in the early 1730s, 1740s, and so on, goes through to the end of the century. So, and yes, I think I think in his analysis has a nice feel to it, if you like. I mean, as I said, historians say, it's far too sharp and crude, but I mean, there is a sense that you have this. You're moving towards from absolutism to enlightened absolutism. You're moving out of this period of, again, you could look at it from the starting with the creation of the nation state. You're moving into of course, constantly this nation state is becoming more and more coherent, more and more emphatic. But it's a process by which it's also changing its purpose as an identity, and in that sense, this is part of that shift.
Yeah, well, exactly. And in terms of shifts, looking at the present day, how do you see the legacy of the Enlightenment continuing to influence contemporary society, particularly in liberal democracies and global institutions like the United Nations?
Well, this is where the book ends, and I think that the influence is, I mean, I think, first of all, it's an unfinished project. It's still with us. It's still ongoing. And if you think about it in terms of the bringing together of peoples, not the destruction of the nations. If you think about the nation state as a creation of the 19th century, of course not, but it has its roots in 1648, has roots in the 17th century. The nation state, as it's emerged in its most caricatural form, let's say Brexit, is the most caricatural form. This thing which shuts itself off from the outside world, which sees people as being determined by their place, by their identity, by their social identity, by their family liaisons, by their political allegiances, and so on. That is something that the Enlightenment has tried to break down. That, of course, is much earlier than this. And to see things as being, yes, these things are important. No one's not denying that. They exist in the world. They have to continue to exist in the world. But what the Enlightenment what did or is doing, because it's still continuing, is to force people to recognize that you don't live alone on this planet, and you don't live in the states in which you live are not just states in which you conduct a series of friendly or not so friendly international relations with other states, but that's where it ends. All right, this is a cosmopolitan order. Whether we already exist in a cosmopolitan order, and that cosmopolitan order is becoming more and more cosmopolitan, if you like, more and more international as we move forward in time. So I would say that yes, that the Enlightenment, as I tried to set out in this book, and as I understood it, as they understood it, I hope, I tried to give an account really of what was it's an intellectual history after all. It's not a piece of political dogma. Understood this cosmopolitanization, this internationalization to be, and that, you know, what are the manifestations of that, which you mentioned the United Nations, liberal democracies, global institutions. These have massively increased, not only since the 18th century, but since 1947, 1945, 1946, 1947, 1948. You know, take 1948, which is the Declaration of Human Rights, that as a point, just as a date, so 1648 to 1948, and you have this huge, you know, globalization, not just of institution, not just of the economy. This is all part of, but also of human understanding, if you like, this sympathy or pity, as Rousseau called it, which extended to all human beings, or was believed in that day, has now taken institutional form. Yeah. And if I may plug something, you mentioned my last book, which was on indeed on the European Union and the attempt to create a European Union, as I was partly as a response to the Brexit crisis, of course, but which was the last published one in English, but there's one that came out after that in Italian, which is going to be published in September by Polity Press, called Beyond States. And that tries to take this story precisely down, not just to today, but in some projected hypothesis into the future.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, I will certainly be reading. I've got your paperback edition here of The Enlightenment While It Still Matters, which I've been utilising. And yeah, it's just leaves me to say thank you so much for joining us, Professor Anthony Pagden, and for sharing so much with us.
Thank you very much for having me.